Sometimes we forget why we're here. It's easy to fall off track. These help us remember.
These battle scars don't look like they're fading, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Growing up, I had a dream, something no one else could see. Tell me what it means when your faith is falling beneath your knees and you can't breathe. Everything you see reminds you of what you're not or something you won't be. You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business. Not because they wanna do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shame. And that's the reason I'm staying up late, trying to find a way to escape the stereotypes this day and age is making me feel like the only way I'll be happy is getting signed to a label and making money through rapping. I wanna share my emotion because this world is attacking the very principle of life that lets the people be happy. If you don't have a reason to breathe, why even live? These battle scars are impressions of everything that it is.
Don't look like they're fading, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battle scars don't look like they're fading, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
If I had a voice that reached 100 million people, I'd tell them there's a reason that we're all created equal. Cause some decide to be great and some decide a sequel to an average person's life is simply what they want to be. So you make your decision, all I know is what I'm given won't define the life I lead or the way I dwell in existence. I've seen a greater image on the walls of where I'm living, and the words twisted and scripted remind me of something written. Faith is a gift that is given down to the people. If one believes it, one receives it. It's given if it is needed. Don't ever think you're trapped in a life that you never wanted. Your options are infinite, that's some mathematical logic. I'm not saying I'm a prophet, I'm speaking for what it's worth. These lyrics define my prayers and these battle scars on my church. Not saying I'm a prophet, I'm speaking for what it's worth. These lyrics define my prayers, these battle scars on my church.
Scars don't look like they're fading, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battle scars don't look like they're fading, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Okay, everyone. Yes, I'm sorry that the stream is late. Some people in chat absolutely guessed what had gotten my attention. Perhaps I'll do a different show on that, but just suffice it to say, I am definitely not in agreement with my home state on a recent decision that they made. And we're going to leave that at that because that is not the subject of the show. So let's do the quick YouTuber introduction. If you are new to this channel, I would absolutely love it if you would subscribe. This is probably going to be a long show. When I do legal stuff, I don't do shallow. And I also read extensively from the case, and there is a lot of highlighting. So be prepared for the long haul with this one. We might even have to divide it into 2 shows. You can follow me on Twitter. I didn't mean to hit that one again. It's right here. My name is Karen Ann Harlow, CarynAnnHarlos. And last but not least, you can support me on Patreon, which is patreon.com/Pink Flame of Liberty. So what are we talking about today? We are talking about the presidential immunity case. I didn't well, I did take notes in my highlighting, but other than that, I haven't taken any notes. I haven't written anything in the margins because remember the last case we covered? Crap, which one was it? Oh, it was the Colorado Supreme Court case in which I didn't really have an opinion when I dug into it. And I formed my opinion, which actually was opposite of what I thought it would be as I read through the highlights. Now, I do have an opinion on this one, but as we talk through it and I say things out loud, who knows? I may change my mind. It is wonderfully freeing to be able to come to this case and that Colorado Supreme Court case, because that was about Trump too, by the way, without having any loyalty to the Republicans or the Democrats. I literally could not give a on their squabbles. But I'm going to let you know that I said this on Twitter, two things can be true at the same time. I don't like Trump. Everyone knows that. But putting that aside, I do think he is absolutely being persecuted by lawfare. I do not believe he is guilty of insurrection and all the crap that they are throwing at him. They are just absolutely hate him with a deranged, mindless mob. Let's just leave it at that. That can be true. And it can be true that the Supreme Court got it wrong. Because when I'm looking at a Supreme Court decision, I am looking at it on principle outside of, except where it intersects with the specific fact pattern. But what I'm trying to say is, I'm removing Trump from the equation. I'm viewing this more in isolation, though obviously the specific facts will come into play. But I am distancing myself from my opinion that they are just going after Trump to destroy him. We will deal with that a little bit because there are fears on both sides that I think are legitimate fears. Like when I say that I think they got it wrong, people will rightfully say to me, yeah, but what they're doing to former President Trump is just ridiculous. And if they didn't rule this way, then the floodgates are opened. I understand that fear. I also understand the fear that is well expressed by the dissent. I disagree with the characterization of so many people that the dissents were poorly written. They were not. Or that they were merely shrieking DNC talking points. They were not. The dissents are actually well written, and I never agree with Justice Jackson, but I do agree with her on this. I rarely agree with Justice Sotomayor, but I absolutely agree with her dissent in this case, and it's well written. Jackson's is not quite as well written. Lack of experience, whatever it might be. Now, the majority opinion is very well written, but as I said to my husband when I was reading it, I got this weird feeling, and it was the same feeling where you can read a really good writer or you hear a really good debater, and you're like, am I convinced because the writing is so good, or because they are such a skilled debater, or because they're right? And I had gotten that sense back when I was a minarchist. We're going way back. We're going back to 2015. And there was that last shred of hope that was going to keep me firmly on the side of minarchy. What everyone kept recommending to me, read Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He answers that question. And Nozick is such a beautiful writer, and he has a beautiful, he's deceased now, he had such a beautiful mind that you could become enthralled and entranced by it. But as I'm reading the book, I'm like, he just did a little sleight of hand there, didn't he? he didn't quite cover his tracks well enough. The way that Nozick justifies a microstate or mini-state, I forget the way he called it, minimalist state, is by redefining the word state. Oh, of course, I can justify a state too, if I can redefine it. And he even admits it, but he does it so beautifully, you almost don't notice. So, yes, the majority opinion is a lot of very well-written words, but I think they're wrong. And would it result in this particular case in the weaponization against Trump? Yeah, it would. But we also have to think towards the future. And this just, solidifies me. If you're wondering why I keep itching, I'm breaking out in hives because I am super upset over what my state did. And when I get super upset over things, I do literally break out in hives. And I am so upset with Colorado right now, I am breaking out in hives. So let's distract ourselves with this case. Yes, but all this does is solidify in me a hatred of the state, because it's impossible to have it both ways. So you have the panic on one side that this will just victimize Trump and any former president after him if it was ruled the right way, And then you have the dissent that says this has basically made the most powerful person in the world outside the law, above the law. Despite all the beautiful writing where they claim they didn't do that, I agree with the dissent. They, in fact, did do that. But I think when you're dealing with the state, these are inevitable outcomes. The sword of the state and the weapons of the state will be used against the outsider, or against the other, or against the one that the deep state, the power structures just hate with an irrational hatred, or you have to give the executive king-like power. There is no other way. To me, this just reinforces, it's going to be really weird that I'm going to be reading a constitutional law case when, in fact, I'm not a constitutionalist. I agree with Spooner that the Constitution was either designed to get us right into the hellhole we are right now, or it was powerless to stop it. Now, I don't think it was designed to get us here. I think it's powerless to stop it. It is a parchment promise, as one of these justices said. God, I'm so breaking out in hives. Okay, so we're going to get right to the decision now. Oh, thank you, Todd, for sticking in chat the PDF of the finding. I normally stick that on screen, but there was just too much. If you put the link, though, I will stick it, I'll display it on the screen. So we're going to go through the majority. I might not read everything I highlighted, but that's at least on the table. But I think it's really important to read the actual holding, or at least enough to understand what's going on. So there was an indictment for the conduct of President Trump following the November 2020 election. So Trump moved to dismiss the indictment based on presidential immunity, arguing that a president has absolute immunity for criminal prosecution for actions performed within, and these terms always get me, the outer perimeter of his official responsibilities. Man, they just cloak so much outright statism in these fancy words. It's like when they found the right to an abortion in a penumbra of the Constitution. Fancy words to cover dirty deeds. And that the indictment's allegations fell within the core of his official duties. The district court denied Trump's motion to dismiss, holding that former presidents do not possess federal criminal immunity for any acts. Now, I know a lot of people will not agree with me. I don't believe in immunity. I don't believe in any immunity. I think the government and all of its actors should be just as liable as any other person. Now, the fact patterns and applying the facts of an issue may result in greater deference to certain decisions, or rebuttable presumptions I'm not so bad with, but claims of any kind of absolute immunity are utter horseshit and utterly unlibertarian. Okay, so here's the holding. And they rely upon this. This is the paper that they plaster everything over with. Our constitutional structure of separated powers. That is the gloss. That's the fairy dust that they sprinkle over everything to make it okay. And believe it or not, Justice Jackson really dismantled that. Says the nature of presidential power entitles a former president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. Those are some strange terms, and I've seen people define them differently, and some people might disagree with how I'm going to define it. I think we understand conclusive authority, but what is preclusive authority? If you look it up legally, it is dealing with the doctrine of equitable estoppel, that basically the thing has already been decided, res judicata. And where I think they're applying that here is there are certain decisions, certain authorities that are vested in the president alone. And they'll list them out, such as, granting of pardons, recognition of foreign nations, appointments of certain officials. And I believe that's what they're getting at with preclusive authority, that Congress cannot yank back or criminalize that authority that is granted explicitly and solely to the president. I believe that's what they're getting at with preclusive authority. I'd love to know if anyone disagreed. And it says, and he's entitled to at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts. Do not, actually I said before I probably wouldn't have a problem with presumptive immunity. I actually do. And there's an alternative to that Justice Jackson lays out, and I believe Justice Sotomayor lays out as well. Rather than going for an absolute, just freezing, oh no, there's presumptive immunity and you have to rebut the assumption, the better way to deal with the fact that, although the law applies equally to all people, not everyone is similarly situated with similar knowledge and responsibilities and burdens and duties, and that's why you have juries that apply the law to the facts of the case, and they are granted some leeway in their judgment, whether you like it or not. That's not relativism. It's applying absolute standards to relative situations, and I do think that is completely valid. So the better way to handle this, as the dissent says, is in an affirmative defense that they'll get into, rather than into some rebuttable presumptive immunity. And it says, this is the first criminal prosecution in our nation's history of a former president for actions taken during his presidency. Determining whether and under what circumstances such a prosecution may proceed requires careful assessment of the scope of presidential power under the Constitution. And then here's where they just start going into the land of make-believe. The nature of that power requires a former president to have some immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts during his tenure in office. Rubin, the Imitator Act, by saying, I don't believe in immunity for criminal actions for state actors. Do you mean you don't believe in the justice of immunity? Yeah, that's what I mean. Obviously, it exists. We see qualified immunity invoked all the time. That's like saying I don't believe in taxes. I mean, I look at my paycheck. Obviously, taxes are gone out. When I say I don't believe in it, I am saying I don't hold it as a principle. I hold it actually as evil. And going to the statement here that the nature of that power requires some kind of immunity, I actually think the nature of that power and the extent of that power requires accountability, not immunity. Okay, and it says at least with regard to the president's exercise of his core constitutional powers. Just because it's something reserved to him alone doesn't mean that he should have absolute, and when I say he, it's not, don't think that I'm referring to Trump. I'm referring in the abstract here, and it would be just as applicable to a female president as well. I'm using the word he the way it's been used to refer to both sexes throughout history. This immunity must be absolute. Actually, I think the opposite. As for his remaining official actions, he's entitled to at least presumptive immunity. And then it goes on to say that Article 2 of the Constitution vests executive power in a president. A president has duties of unrivaled gravity and breadth. His authority to act necessarily stems from either an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself. So in the latter case, the president's authority is sometimes conclusive and preclusive. When the president exercises such authority, Congress cannot act on and courts cannot examine the president's actions. I think that is extremely short-sighted. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself into a bit of what the dissent said, but I'm going to make an analogy here that when, say, in a derivative action against a corporation, the court, in looking at the actions of a board of directors, grants great deference to their decisions under a doctrine known as the business judgment rule. So that is the sort of thing. I think they call it later like the public servant rule or something like that, that such a thing should be judged under. So it says courts cannot examine the president's actions. I don't think they can examine or criminalize that he has the right, say, to pardon somebody. But I do think that they can examine if he took a bribe to pardon somebody. That he can't have absolute immunity for taking a bribe to pardon somebody. The preclusive and conclusive authority presumes that it's lawful, that it can't be made unlawful by Congress wresting away power that's been solely vested in the executive in the Constitution. The vesting of that power in and of itself does not give license for lawlessness. It's like when libertarians say that parents have the right to raise their children in the way they see fit. That means even, it is explicitly stated in our platform, but it doesn't even need to be stated. That isn't so absolute that it means you can chop body parts off of your children, even if they allegedly consent, because that would be abuse. So this exclusive power does not paper over knowing and willful criminal acts, such as taking a bribe. Where it would get hazy, as it does in any criminal case, is on mens rea. Was there an intent to commit a crime? Mens rea is usually a necessary factor in criminal acts. So, kind of similar to the business judgment rule, no, unlike the panic button that this majority opinion will press, it will not just open the president up or former president up to, being sued for every single decision or being prosecuted for every single decision that they make. And I think the dissent correctly argued that we have alleged safeguards in our system to protect against that. Meanwhile, the majority opinion is like those safeguards aren't sufficient and there will be political motivations and blah. Yeah, that's all true. So why should the president get special protection against that when you and I wouldn't? There are political figures that aren't elected. If you think Alex Jones is not a political figure, but he doesn't have, Wayne probably figured I got a drink here, but I probably need a second one.
You need a second one.
Yeah, but you're making my camera bounce around with you, the way you walk all heavy-footed. If you're wondering why my camera's bouncing, that's why. We have this weird floating floor in the basement. It doesn't sit like on the ground. Okay. He put the light back. He turned the light off on me. So anyway, yes, it doesn't paper over criminality. Okay. Whoa. Oh, I do have two pairs of glasses. If you guys are wondering, wait, aren't those the same glasses? Yeah, I have them in black. And I have them in pink. Yesterday I had no glasses down. Now I've got two. It says, the reasons that justify the president's absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for acts within the scope of his exclusive constitutional authority do not extend to conduct in areas where his authority is shared with Congress. Then he would have presumptive immunity. And it says the framers designed the presidency to be vigorous and energetic, and by their reasoning, this then requires absolute immunity. They say, appreciating the unique risks that arise when the president's energies are diverted by proceedings that might render him unduly cautious in the discharge of his duties. I don't know about you, but I want the most powerful person in the world. I don't want any rulers at all, but if we're going to have one, I want them. What is unduly cautious to not be a criminal? I don't know. And I understand there are things that are crimes that I wouldn't consider crimes. When I'm talking in things like this, I'm talking about things I actually would consider crimes, like fraud and violence and murder, stuff like that. I do want the president to be how can you be unduly cautious not to kill or commit fraud? I don't think you can be cautious enough. I don't think the phrase unduly cautious even applies. Because remember, we are talking about criminal acts. They don't get it. This case isn't about civil penalties. They already talk about how the president already has immunity on civil penalties. We're not going to be getting into that into this show. We are talking about criminal acts. The courts, and then they cite a decision over and over and over again that I'll probably want to read, which would be familiar to you guys. It's in the case of Nixon, so it's Nixon versus Fitzgerald. So they cite the Fitzgerald case constantly. That was a civil case, if I'm remembering correctly from everything I read here about the improper discharge, firing of somebody from an appointed position. They'll explicate it later on here, but it was also a civil case. And remember, civil has a much lower burden of proof. I could understand getting a little squirrely about being sued civilly. Because remember, what's the burden of proof in a civil case? The preponderance of the evidence, which means that more likely than not, even if only by a little bit, by 51%, that's preponderance of the evidence. Whereas criminal is beyond a shadow of the doubt. So the burden of proof is way different. And what they're citing from is a civil case, not a criminal case. So it said the court's dominant concern was to avoid, and the court they're talking about is in the Fitzgerald court, dealing with civil. If I'm remembering correctly, somebody please correct me if I'm wrong in chat. Because again, this was like 160 pages or whatever. Was to avoid diversion of the president's attention during the decision-making process caused by needless worry as to the possibility of damages. Action. So yeah, it was a civil case stemming from any particular official decision. Oh, I know what I was getting at with the Alex Jones thing. So you don't think in his civil case, I know it wasn't a criminal case, that there wasn't political implications, that people didn't decide that based upon political feelings? Now, let's say someone like Alex Jones then got judged criminally. You don't think the weight when you're dealing with a nationwide controversial figure would cause the same prejudices? You go, yeah, but he's not the president. Oh, so the president is more special and important than us. Got it. I got that loud and clear through here. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Got it. Criminally prosecuting a president for official conduct undoubtedly poses a far greater threat of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch than simply seeking evidence in his possession. This is referring back to just an earlier decision that even though the president could be immune from certain liability, they still could be compelled to comply with a subpoena for records, though some records could be deemed unfit for public disclosure. So what they're saying is there already was some immunity granted for mere disclosure of documents. Certainly, a criminal prosecution poses a greater threat of intrusion on the authority and functions. I would say actually committing crimes poses a far greater threat. Okay. The danger is greater than what led the court to recognize absolute presidential immunity from civil damages liability, that the president would be chilled from taking the bold and unhesitating action required of an independent executive. They really did a sleight of hand there, that the dissent points out, well, so I'm not going to get into it. We'll let the dissent speak for it. But I hope you caught it. If you haven't read the dissent, the absolute utter baloney in what they just said. On what they said, if they were using that as their guiding principle, should actually have led them to the opposite conclusion. So, taking into account these competing considerations, the court concludes that the separation of powers, they will invoke separation of powers so many times, explicated in the court's precedent, necessitate at least a presumptive immunity from criminal prosecution for a president's acts within the outer perimeter of his official responsibility. I'm surprised they didn't use penumbra. And then this is what the right will go, yeah, but this is a hollow promise. It says, the separation of powers does not bar a prosecution predicated on the president's unofficial acts. And no one claimed it did. Everyone keeps hanging their hat on this like, oh, but the court said this. Nobody thought differently before, and no one's going to think differently afterwards. That's like saying the separation of powers does not mean that water isn't wet. Well, gee, thank you, Captain Obvious. The first step in deciding whether a former president is entitled to immunity from a particular prosecution is to distinguish his official from unofficial actions. Okay, fine. In this case, no court thus far has drawn that distinction in general or with respect to the conduct alleged in particular. It is therefore incumbent upon the court, meaning this court, to be mindful that it is a court of final review and not first review. And that's because the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction, not primary. However, they kind of seem to be like bitch slapping the lower court a little bit, going, you didn't even bother to divide the two actions. That's because the lower court did not recognize this expansive view of immunity, where they would have to parse it out. They basically were like, if it's a crime, it's a crime. If it were a civil liability case, they would have parsed it out. In my opinion, I think they would have had to. It says, when a president takes acts pursuant to a constitutional and statutory authority, he takes official action. Fine. Determining whether an action is covered by immunity thus begins with assessing the president's authority to take that action, but the breadth of the president's discretionary responsibilities under the Constitution and laws of the United States frequently makes it difficult to determine which of his innumerable functions encompasses a particular action. Very important line there. Or whether, like you mixed your labor with the land. Did you mix your official acts with your unofficial acts in such a way that they're indistinguishable? Is this like determining whether or not the Pope was speaking ex cathedra or not? In dividing official from unofficial conduct, courts may not inquire into the president's motives. Which of us have such glorious protection? Sometimes that's the only way you can determine if it's an official or unofficial act. So basically, they threw this bone saying, yeah, if it was unofficial, there's no immunity. But then they take away the very tools you would use to determine whether it was unofficial. Such a highly intrusive inquiry. How the bleep is that highly intrusive? Would risk exposing even the most obvious instances of official conduct to judicial examination on the mere allegation of improper use. That is not the way criminal cases work. Now, we might be in a banana republic right now, and that might be the way these particular cases against Trump are working. But on paper, at least, that's not the way they're supposed to work. There are robust protections allegedly in place, again on paper, in criminal prosecutions that do not exist in a civil context. Presidents would be subject to trial on every allegation that an action was unlawful. Well, not any more than somebody who doesn't like you could keep calling the police on you, saying everything you were doing is illegal. That's just not the way it works. Depriving immunity of its intended effect. Notice that they jumped from it's already well settled that there is absolute civil immunity to now this transfers over to absolute immunity under the core functions and presumptive immunity in the outer perimeter, and then saying it's circular. So basically saying there is this immunity, and there's this immunity because if there wasn't this immunity, they would be subject to trial upon mere allegation, thereby making the immunity that they have nonsensical. You just presumed your conclusion in your argument through a lot of very pretty words. Okay, don't worry, I don't have things highlighted on so many cases here. So we're just going to go through some of these counts just to say where the case stands now. The question becomes whether the presumption of immunity is rebutted under the circumstances. So they were dealing with the fact pattern where they identified certain actions of former President Trump as core functions and others on the outer perimeter. And so they were saying, well, we've got to now distinguish between core functions and these other lesser functions that have presumptive rather than absolute immunity. So on the ones where they couldn't just immediately say that was a core function, they remanded that fact finding back down to the district court. Now that is correct. Forget about whether I agree with the reasoning or any of that. The Supreme Court's an appellate court. It is perfectly in line and proper, when the fact finding that they think that they needed was not done, is remanded back down to the district court. So some of this that they remanded had to do with Trump's dealings with the vice president and the events of January 6th itself. So they remanded that down. Now, they claimed that Trump asserted a far broader immunity than the limited one that the court recognizes. I think the dissent tears that apart pretty well. And that Trump contended that the indictment must be dismissed because the impeachment judgment clause requires that impeachment and Senate conviction precede a president's criminal prosecution. But the text of the clause does not address whether and on what conduct a president may be prosecuted if he was never impeached and convicted. I know that there are some, I've read on Twitter and elsewhere, that say, yeah, but there is a difference here because he was impeached, but he wasn't convicted. And therefore, that bars later prosecution for the same things. Just throwing that out there, that's what some people say. Said the Federalist Papers on which Trump relies concerned the checks available against a sitting president. They did not endorse or even consider whether the impeachment judgment clause immunizes a former president from prosecution. And then they wail long and hard again about if there isn't these immunities, the president will be unduly hindered in discharge of his official duties, and say the Constitution does not tolerate such impediments to the effective functioning of the government. Well, I tolerate all such impediments. Okay, so Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. Thomas, Alito, Gorch, and Kavanaugh joined in full. Barrett joined in part. And she has some really interesting discussion. Actually, I think she's the one who brought up like the affirmative defense issue. I thought it was in the defense. No, it was actually in the concurrence. It was in Barrett's concurrence. Her concurrence was very interesting. Thomas filed a concurring opinion. And then Sotomayor filed a dissenting opinion in which Kagan and Jackson joined, and Jackson also filed a dissenting opinion. Okay, so now we're getting into, so that was the synopsis. So now we're getting into the meat of it, where I have a lot of highlights, but also you could tell I'm skipping a lot of pages. they go back into the immunity from civil liabilities. Okay. It says the parties do not dispute that a former president can be subject to criminal prosecution for unofficial acts committed while in office. They also agree that some of the conduct described in the indictment includes actions taken by Trump in his unofficial capacity. They disagree, however, about whether a former president can be prosecuted for his official actions. And they conclude, at least with respect to the president's exercise of his core constitutional powers, his immunity must be absolute. As to his remaining official actions, he is also entitled to immunity. At the current stage of proceedings in this case, however, we need not and do not decide whether that immunity must be absolute or instead whether a presumptive immunity is sufficient. So, notice that they left the door open to absolute immunity, even in things that they're describing as the perimeter of his duties. They did not answer that question. All they answered it with was at least a presumptive immunity must be in place. That didn't say that was the maximum. That was the minimum, leaving the door open for absolute immunity in those cases. But they said that was not ripe at this point because there was not enough factual analysis done by the district court. So after things they got remanded, worked their way back up, then we might have another whole case on it where they're going to have to answer that question. So, let me see here. Says if a president claims authority to act, but in fact exercises mere individual will and authority without law, the courts may say so. Okay. For instance, we held that President Truman exceeded his constitutional authority when he seized most of the nation's steel mills. I would say you have exceeded your constitutional authority even in core constitutional functions if you engage in crimes while doing them. It's like that shouldn't even need to be said. It's like libertarians don't have to go around qualifying every statement with as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. That's just implicit. For it to be just for you to do something, it's that it does not commit physical force or fraud against somebody else. You don't have to add that qualifier to everything. But they're like making it, no, they said this was a function. They didn't say you couldn't commit a crime when you were doing it. To me, that should be implied when you're dealing with the Constitution, which is supposed to be the foundation for lawful order, that the actions have to be lawful. They're not made lawful. Oh, this almost reminds me like divine command theory. Acts of God, are they good, or are they good because God did them? That's almost like what this is. Like, we can't examine whether the president, in exercise of the core constitutional authority, engaged in crime. The very fact that he was doing his core constitutional authority washes all of that. So it's basically like divine command theory. If God said it, it must be good. God didn't say it because it was good. It was good because God said it. Todd Hicks, I think you misunderstood a quote from here. So he says, isn't the remand to the lower court telling them to decide on where the lines of absolute immunity end? No. The remand was to see to separate out the official acts from the unofficial acts. And it seemed to imply, I want to put this back up, I'm sorry, there's a timer on it. It also seemed to imply, and the official acts would be acts on the perimeter of his core constitutional, well, I wouldn't say core because the core means the middle, of his authority. So if they determine it's official, then this court kind of already engaged in some fact-finding that perhaps it shouldn't have, that these, if they are official, they would be on the perimeter of his official authority. If they're unofficial, then this court has nothing left to do with it, since everybody agrees that he can be prosecuted for unofficial acts, though there would be still an appeal as to whether they were official or unofficial. But the lower court was remanded to the lower court to make those determinations. The type of immunity they left open, that, and they would be the final deciders as to whether it was absolute or merely rebuttably presumptive. Okay, clear as mud. Oh, and where they said, they repeatedly say SCOTUS should be the final voice, not the first voice. No, that's where you're misunderstanding them. They are to be the final voice on what the law is. They are not the final voice on what the facts are. That is, that needs to go down to the lower court to make those distinguish, and then it would go up. Hopefully I explained that decently enough. Okay, we already went over that. I'm not going to repeat things, because as I was reading it in stages. And they do note that there really is a dearth of stare decisis, past decisions that would help guide them. They say one case in more than 2 centuries does not afford enough experience to definitively and comprehensively determine the president's scope of immunity from criminal prosecution. There might not be case law, but the dissent certainly gives a lot of historical facts. It says, despite the... I should start drinking more of my margarita. Despite the unprecedented nature of this case and the very significant constitutional questions that it raises, the lower courts rendered their decisions on a highly expedited basis. So, criticize them for going too fast. I agree. That's because we're in a banana republic right now. And these are kangaroo courts, just to keep mixing our metaphors. Well, we didn't really mix them. We just used a multitudinous metaphors. Yeah, they ramrodded it through. They railroaded it through. God, we're just keep going with these metaphors. Why don't we? Because those courts categorically rejected any form of presidential immunity, they did not analyze the conduct alleged in the indictment to decide which of it should be categorized as official and which unofficial. Neither party has briefed that issue before us, though they did discuss it at oral argument in response to questions. And like the underlying immunity question, that categorization raises multiple unprecedented and momentous questions about the powers of the president and the limits of his authority under the Constitution. Now, Kathy asks the really important question. Is that a spicy margarita? No, but I really could use a spicy margarita at this point. But no. Wayne did bring me, though, a second helping. I need it. Okay. As noted, there is little pertinent precedent on those subjects to guide our review of this case, a case that we too are deciding on an expedited basis, less than 5 months after we granted the government's request to construe Trump's emergency application for a stay as a petition for certiorari, grant that petition, and answer the consequential immunity question. I know these things take a while, but to me, like, I just get Forrest Whitaker eye when 5 months after you got indicted is considered expedited. Now, I know the Supreme Court moves slowly, but still. Already doing and now our watch begins when it comes to the Sixth Circuit appeal with a case that the LNC is involved in. That court certainly moves slowly. Our oral argument was, what was it, June 13th? And so it's only been a couple weeks and I feel like it's moving slowly. 5 months, I mean, that's torturous. But when they had said the parties did not brief these questions, but did talk about them during oral argument questions, I was just thinking back to listening to the oral argument in the case that the LNC is involved in, where the en banc means a panel of judges. So the en banc, the panel of judges individually, they didn't all yell questions at once, but ask questions of both sides. Which were answered, though in our particular case it was explicating things that were fully briefed, but I could understand how things could come up that were not briefed. So the court goes on to say, we offer guidance on these issues. Determining whether an action is covered by immunity thus begins with assessing the president's authority to take that action. So they've by now presumed immunity. If it's official, it's got some kind of immunity. To me, the president has the authority to take lawful action. The president does not have the authority to take unlawful action. To cop a phrase from another libertarian who used this word far too many times in something that they wrote to the Judicial Committee, is a ultra-virus, or virus, excuse me. I never know how to pronounce these Latin words. Ultra-virus, I think. Am I pronouncing that right? Somebody out there tell me if I'm pronouncing that right. Okay. In dividing official from unofficial conduct, courts may not inquire into the president's motives. That was done in the synopsis, but oh my God, is that terrible. They said otherwise they would just be so tortured by continual prosecution under bare allegations of malice. Again, that's not the way the criminal system works. And here's where they disagree with me. Nor may courts deem an action unofficial. I wouldn't deem it unofficial. I would deem it illegitimate. I think the powers granted to the president under the Constitution means the legitimate exercise of them. Just like you can't pardon somebody because somebody paid you a lot of money to do so. Nor may courts deem an action unofficial merely because it allegedly violates a generally applicable law. Hard disagree. For instance, then they get into that civil case again. I don't think that applies. To apply the standards in a civil case to a criminal case is just ludicrous to me. Okay. As you can see, I skipped past a bunch of pages. They did a really good job in the synopsis, though, that you could get a really good feel for the majority opinion just by reading those 7 to 10 pages. So, oh my God, this is a long... Yeah, we got quite a bit to read here, but this, I think, is probably important. I'll skip past some paragraphs if it's not. The government does not dispute that if Trump is entitled to immunity for certain official acts, he may not be held criminally liable based upon those acts. That's like saying if the government agrees that if it's a circle, it's round. What? Okay, obviously, if you have immunity, you can't be prosecuted. Okay, Captain Obvious. But nevertheless, it contends that a jury could consider evidence, this is so important, concerning the president's official acts for limited and specified purposes, and that such evidence would be admissible to prove, for example, and then they put in Trump's knowledge or notice of the falsity of his election fraud claims. Let's remove Trump out of this. Well, let's read a little bit further and then I'll explain it. I think they probably explain it well. I'm on page 31 of the main decision. That proposal threatens to eviscerate the immunity we have recognized. The immunity that you carved out of whole cloth is for official acts. Let me try to give another analogy here. When a co-conspirator or sometimes you get the two people in court to turn against each other, and you give one of them immunity from prosecution and they turn on the other. Just because they have immunity doesn't mean that they can't be compelled to testify, because they're no longer testifying against themselves. Now, they didn't get into the Fifth Amendment thing here for the thing that they're testifying about. If they got into the right not to self-incriminate, that would be something different. And it's, now that I'm saying it, it's very interesting that did not come up here. It says it would permit a prosecutor to do indirectly what he cannot do directly. Invite the jury to examine acts for which a president is immune from prosecution to prove his liability on any charge. It says, if official conduct for which the president is immune may be scrutinized to help secure his conviction, even on charges that purport to be based only on his unofficial conduct, the intended effect of immunity would be defeated. That is quite fearful. So basically, let's go back to the bribery for a pardon thing. If you were trying to convict a former president on bribery, you couldn't inquire at all into the circumstances surrounding the pardon. But the pardon, they're going to get, the dissent will get into this really well, but just realize how quite awful this is that they're saying, and how absolutely unworkable it is. The president's immune conduct would be subject to examination by a jury on the basis of generally applicable criminal laws. Use of evidence about such conduct, even when an indictment alleges only unofficial conduct, even would thereby heighten the prospect that the president's official decision-making would be distorted. So it says, because he can be held liable for criminal unofficial acts which stem from official acts, his official acts will be unduly constrained. I mean, come on. You don't want to be liable for your criminal unofficial acts. That's unreasonable. The government asserts that these weighty concerns can be managed by the district court through the use of evidentiary rulings and jury instructions. Yeah, just like they are for you or me. But no, he's special. But such tools are unlikely to protect adequately the president's constitutional prerogatives. Presidential acts frequently deal with matters likely to arouse the most intense feelings. So do actions of private people, like the Alex Jones example I gave earlier. Allowing prosecutors to ask or suggest that the jury probe official acts for which the president is immune would thus raise a unique risk that the jurors' deliberations will be prejudiced by their views of the president's policies and performances while in office. Sorry, Cupcake. That's part of the risk you take by assuming by taking the ring of power. The prosaic tools. Oh, they're prosaic tools when it comes to the president, but they're just fine for you peasants, on which the government would have courts rely, are an inadequate safeguard against the peculiar constitutional concerns implicated in the prosecution of a former president, because he's a much more equal animal than the rest of us. Although such tools may suffice to protect the constitutional rights of individual criminal defendants, the interests that underlie presidential immunity seek to protect not the president himself, but the institution. That sounds awful religious. And they go on to explain more that Trump contends that the indictment must be dismissed because of the impeachment judgment clause requires that impeachment and a Senate conviction preclude a president's criminal prosecution. The court goes on to say, the text of the clause provides little support for such absolute immunity. It states that an impeachment judgment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. It then specifies that the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment. Again, what about if they weren't convicted? That's a whole other thing. In the footnote on page 32, they get into Judge Barrett, who uses a bribery example like I did. We're not going to get into it when the footnote, we'll get into it when we get into Justice Barrett's, it wasn't dissent, it was concurrence in part. It says James Wilson, who served on the committee that drafted the clause, the impeachment clause, and later as a justice of this court, similarly concluded that acquittal of impeachment charges, and that's what I was trying to get to. So never mind conviction, but even being acquitted of impeachment charges posed no bar to subsequent prosecution. Told you this was going to be a long show. Okay, they in the majority opinion, they get to rebut the dissents, which I think is kind of strange, but you know, that's what they're allowed to do. So they go on to the dissents and say, the dissents strike a tone of chilling doom. I did not get the impression that they were over the top. I really did not. I mean, there were some flourishing comments, but there's a lot of flourishing comments in here too of chilling doom if we should dare hold the president accountable for criminal acts. Says the principal dissent starting premise that unlike the speech and debate clause immunity, no constitutional text supports presidential immunity. And they say is one that the court rejected decades ago as unpersuasive, but that was in the civil case. Now, I can see how you would, you can certainly draw from that, because if they found civil immunity without specific text in the in the Constitution, I see where they can get, well, we don't need it then for criminal. I don't agree, but I see where they're getting it from. I don't necessarily agree that there should be immunity from civil damages either, but we are dealing with a criminal case. And I'm on page 37 now of the main opinion. They say, true, there's no presidential immunity clause, but there is no separation of powers clause either. but there is separation of powers. Just because that isn't what it was called. I'm going to draw another really weird analogy here, but people have said this to me about it within the Libertarian Party, the Dallas Accord. It's like, find me where in 1974 they sat down and wrote out something they called the Dallas Accord. No, it was called the Dallas Accord by future people. At the time they were creating history and creating their agreement, they couldn't realize, you wouldn't know what it would be called by future generations later, looking back and describing it prescriptively. They knew they were reaching an agreement, but what it would be called is something that's almost by chance of history. So the Constitution has these distinct branches. The fact that there's no clause saying, and guess what this means? This means that there's 3 distinct branches. Well, that is obvious by the fact that it describes 3 distinct branches. It doesn't need to conclude with, and you see how we just described 3 separate and distinct branches? They are, wait for it, separate and distinct. Nonsense. The principal dissent then cites the impeachment judgment clause, arguing that it clearly contemplates that a former president may be subject to criminal prosecution. And that's correct, it does. And I actually find that weighty. It says, but that clause does not indicate whether a former president may, consistent with separation of powers, which they use to paper over everything, be prosecuted for his official conduct in particular. It doesn't have to say that, because impeachment can be for official or unofficial, and it says, nevertheless, the convicted party can be prosecuted. The dissent is correct. It says the most compelling argument, therefore, is from the Constitution's separation of powers and the judiciary's historic understanding of that doctrine. But they go on to note that the principal dissent's most compelling piece of evidence consists of excerpted statements of Charles Pinckney from an 1800 Senate debate. But those statements reflect only the now discredited argument, again referring to the civil case, which could be wrong, and they've overturned things before. I mean, Dred Scott was law until it wasn't. Says, and Pinckney is not exactly a reliable authority on the separation of powers. What, because you disagree with him? It's certainly someone much closer to the facts at hand. He went on to state on the same day that it was wrong to give the nomination of judges to the president, an opinion expressly rejected by the framers. So, because he disagreed with the framers on a power that he agreed was granted, he just thought it was a mistake to grant it, that he wouldn't understand what the separation of powers were. Because he disagreed with the framers on one thing, he's not a reliable authority on others. That is just ridiculous. Given the framers' desire for an energetic and vigorous president, well, we certainly don't have that in Joe Biden, do we? He's neither energetic nor vigorous. The principal dissent's view that the Constitution they designed allows all his actions to be subject to prosecution, even the exercise of powers it grants exclusively to him, defies credulity. No, it defies credulity that the president can conduct criminal acts under cloak of legitimate authority. unable to muster any meaningful textual, that you're only able to say that they were unable to muster any meaningful contextual or historical support by hand waving away the textual support they did provide, then by saying it's not meaningful. Oh my God, this is even worse than I thought the first time. Conspicuously absent is mention of the fact that since the founding, no president has ever faced criminal charges, let alone for his conduct in office. Accordingly, no court has been faced with the question of a president's immunity from prosecution. All that our nation's practice establishes is silence on this subject. Well, you certainly blew that away in basically making the president a king. And then they go on and say the dissents, sound the alarm bell that this makes the president above the law. I agree with them. It says, no, au contraire, mon frere, like everyone else, the president is subject to prosecution in his unofficial capacity. Everyone already agreed on that. That was never in dispute. That isn't what they were sounding the alarm about. My God, it's almost dishonest. The dissent's positions in the end boil down to ignoring the Constitution's separation of powers and the court's precedent, and instead fear-mongering. There should always be fear-mongering about power. On the basis of extreme hypotheticals about a future where the president feels empowered to violate federal criminal law, because that's exactly what you have done here. That is not an extreme hypothetical. Was it an extreme hypothetical when we said, oh, if you give the government, certain powers, because you were scared after 9/11 that's going to grow into an uncontrollable beast? Was that extreme fear-mongering? Guess what? The people in power said it was at the time. Looking back now, we don't think so much now, do we? There is such a thing as a slippery slope. Okay. I'm going to keep going. It talks about all the risks that presidents, if, oh my God, they'd be held liable for criminal conduct. It said, ignoring these risks, the dissents are instead content to leave the preservation of our system of separated powers up to the good faith of prosecutors. And you are content to leave absolute power and absolute immunity in the hands of the most powerful person on the earth. Yeah, okay. Sure, Jan. This case poses a question of lasting significance. When may a former president be prosecuted for official acts taken during his presidency? Our nation has never before needed an answer. But in addressing the question today, unlike the political branches and public at large, we cannot afford to fixate exclusively or even primarily on present exigencies. I agree with them, which is why I tried to stay away from the really fact-specific stuff about Trump. In a case like this one, focusing on transient results may have profound consequences for the separation of powers and for the future of our republic. Yeah, and you screwed the pooch. Okay. And that is it. I'm starting to lose my voice. Now, Thomas concurring. So page 1 of Thomas's concurrence. Few things would threaten our constitutional order more than criminally prosecuting a former president for his official acts. Listen, I could not give a fig about constitutional order, but let's pretend like I did. I would think few things would threaten our constitutional order more than just allowing absolute immunity for criminal acts. Now, there's something very interesting that I might agree with in Justice Thomas's concurrence that was not brought up in the main case. He goes, I write separately to highlight another way in which this prosecution may violate our constitutional structure. In this case, the Attorney General purported to appoint a private citizen as special counsel to prosecute a former president on behalf of the United States. But I am not sure that any office for the special counsel has been established by law, as the Constitution requires. By requiring that Congress create federal offices by law, the Constitution imposes an important check against the president. He cannot create offices at his pleasure. If there is no law establishing the office that the special counsel occupies, then he cannot proceed with this prosecution. A private citizen cannot criminally prosecute anyone, let alone a former president. Now that I find to be a very interesting argument. And I think we could probably just sum that up right there. Oh, God, this sentence right here. Ooh, you want to talk about Orwell. In this case, and this is still Thomas, there has been much discussion about ensuring that a president is not above the law. But, as the court explains, the president's immunity from prosecution for his official acts is the law. Taxation can't be theft, because the law says it isn't theft. So, divine command theory again. The law says that he's immune from the law. Therefore, that's the law, and he's under the law. And the circle goes round and round. He goes, we must respect the Constitution's separation of powers. Boy, that is just like a magical incantation. Else we risk rendering the Constitution's protection of liberty a parchment guarantee. That was done ages ago when states weren't allowed to secede. Even though they were trying to secede for evil reasons, it was about slavery. You can be mad at me. It was about slavery. But in any words, that is all the Constitution is a parchment guarantee. It shall not be infringed. How many gun laws are there? Now, here's Justice Barrett's concurrence. And I actually enjoyed the concurrences much better. She raises some really interesting points. So she does not agree with immunity, and I agree with her here. It says the president can challenge the constitutionality of a criminal statute as applied to official acts alleged in the indictment, and he can obtain interlocutory review of a trial court's ruling. Okay, I know that phrase, it's a legal phrase, might not be that familiar to you guys. A lot of you listening right now who don't know me that well, because there are several hundred people watching. I'm a paralegal by profession. So that's why some of this terminology I'm a bit more familiar with. An interlocutory is an interlocutory order is a non-final one. Normally, only final orders and judgments can be appealed. But there are certain non-final ones, interlocutory orders that can be. For instance, in the case I was just talking about where the LNC is involved in an appeal in the Sixth Circuit, how come the defendants were able to appeal when the case has not yet gone to trial and there wasn't a final judgment? It's because the LNC was granted a preliminary injunction. That is considered so weighty to be the type of interlocutory order that is appealable. So even though it was non-final, it was a preliminary injunction, it was appealable. So Barrett, was saying that if a president is indicted, put aside immunity, he can obtain interlocutory review of the trial court's ruling. He doesn't need to wait until a conviction. Like the court, the dissenting justices and special counsel all accept that some prosecutions of a president's official conduct may be unconstitutional. As for interlocutory review, our precedent recognizes that resolving certain legal issues before trial is necessary to safeguard important constitutional interests. Okay. And it says the court leaves open the possibility that the Constitution forbids prosecuting the president for any official conduct, instructing the lower courts to address that question in the first instance, and then it's appealable. She said, I would have answered that now, rather than leaving this wide gaping hole. So she says, I would assess the validity of criminal charges predicated on most official acts, i.e. those falling outside the president's core executive power, in two steps. The first question is whether the relevant criminal statute reaches the president's official conduct. Not every broadly worded statute does. I don't agree with her there, but just saying what she said. For example, Section 956 covers conspiracy to murder in a foreign country and does not expressly exclude the president's decisions to, say, order a hostage rescue mission abroad. The underlying murder statute, however, covers only unlawful killings. The Office of Legal Counsel has interpreted that phrase to reflect a public authority exception. That's what I was trying to get to. For official acts involving the military or law enforcement, she goes on that she's not even getting into whether she agrees with that interpretation. She's just noting that interpretation. So she says, I express no view about the merits of that interpretation, but it does show that the threshold question of statutory interpretation is a non-trivial step. This two-step analysis, considering first whether the statute applies, then whether its application to the particular facts is constitutional, is similar to the approach that the special counsel presses in this court. An important difference is in this case is that the president is entitled to an interlocutory appeal of any trial court's ruling. A criminal defendant in a federal court normally must wait until after trial to seek review of the trial court's refusal to dismiss charges. So she says, because of the public authority, what did she call it again? Like public authority doctrine or exception. Public authority exception avails to the president that rather than raising immunity, the affirmative defense of a public authority exception should be the route that is employed. And I actually don't have as much of a problem with that. And I wouldn't call it a public authority exception, but I would call it's a different kind of circumstance than your average everyday person would find themselves into. And when you're judging the criminality of something, the knowledge, the intent, all of that, you have to take in the totality of the circumstances. And the fact that someone was a public figure acting in an official capacity certainly would weigh into that. She says, I understand most of the court's opinion to be consistent with these views. She goes, I don't, however, join that the Constitution limits the introduction of protected conduct as evidence in a criminal prosecution of a president beyond the limits afforded by executive privilege. I disagree with the holding on this. The Constitution does not require blinding juries to the circumstances surrounding conduct for which presidents can be liable. I absolutely agree with her. Oh, and she worded this so beautifully. To make sense of charges, so she talks about the issue of a bribe for a pardon, for instance. says, excluding from trial any mention of the official act, i.e. the pardon, connected to the bribe would hamstring the prosecution. To make sense of the charges alleging a quid pro quo, the jury must be allowed to hear about both the quid and the quo, even if the quo, standing alone, could not be a basis for the president's criminal liability. That is such beautifully written legal opinion right there. That, well done, Justice Barrett. So, she says, the Constitution does not insulate presidents from criminal liability for official acts. I agree with her. But any statute regulating the exercise of executive power is subject to a constitutional challenge. I wish she had written the majority. It would have been much more narrowly, much better. I'm impressed. I'm impressed with her concurrence. A criminal statute is no exception. Thus, a president facing prosecution may challenge the constitutionality of a criminal statute as applied to the official acts alleged in the indictment. If that challenge fails, however, he must stand trial. So now we're going to get to the dissents. I wish Barrett wrote the majority on that. Or was in the majority. Just because someone wrote it, I mean, the votes were the votes. So Justice Sotomayor starts with, because our Constitution does not shield a former president from answering for criminal and treasonous acts. This is, I think, the first time treason has even come up. So yeah, that is a bit over the top. More than a bit over the top. I dissent. We could have just stuck with criminal. Now, here's where she, I think, masterfully takes apart their papering over. Their look over there, don't look over here, in the majority opinion. Whether described as presumptive or absolute under the majority's rule, a president's use of any official power for any purpose, even the most corrupt, is immune from prosecution. That is just as bad as it sounds, and it is baseless. Finally, the majority declare that evidence concerning acts for which the president is immune can play no role in any criminal prosecution against him. The majority's project will have disastrous consequences for the presidency and for our democracy. I don't give a crap about democracy. The main takeaway of today's decision is that all of a president's officials' acts, defined without regard to motives or intent, are entitled to immunity that is at least presumptive and quite possibly absolute. The majority calls for a careful assessment of the scope of presidential power under the Constitution. For the majority, that careful assessment does not involve the Constitution's text. I would start there. The Constitution's text contains no provision for immunity from criminal prosecution for former presidents. The omission in the text of the Constitution is worth noting for at least three reasons. First, the framers clearly knew how to provide for immunity from prosecution. That's even interesting because I'm now thinking of rules of interpretation and Robert's Rules of Order, where it says, if one thing is mentioned specifically, things of the same or lower class are expressly prohibited. Now, I know this is a higher class, but I'm just saying they showed that they know how to do this. It isn't like, they just presumed you all would just know this. If they did expressly provide for immunity in other circumstances, which they did in the speech or debate clause. So they certainly knew how to provide for that and did not for the presidents. What's it? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but there is evidence. And the fact that they did it in one spot, but did not do it in the other. Like, let me give you another example. Say you had a book in front of you, And this comes from the book called Historical Fallacies, which is a great book if you haven't read it before. Say you have a book in front of you that purports to be the history of New York City, but you don't know when this history was written. Like, say this is a book 50, 100 years from now, and you uncover this book and you're trying to date it to determine when it was written. And in reviewing it, you notice there is no mention of the 9/11 attacks. Well, you can pretty much conclude that it was written before that date, at least, because that's such a momentous thing, particularly if it mentions other terrorists attacked. And shows that it knew how to mention bombings, and then certainly it would know how to mention planes flying into a building. Second, some state constitutions at the time of the framing specifically provided express criminal immunities to sitting governors. So the executives in states, and remember we're supposed to be this confederacy of states, did that. So they had a template for it. It was something that was already in the zeitgeist. And then she goes on to say, which they mentioned in the majority, but I want to read what she actually said. Third, insofar as the Constitution does speak to this question, it actually contemplates some form of criminal liability for former presidents. The majority correctly rejects Trump's argument that a former president cannot be prosecuted unless he has been impeached by the House and convicted by the Senate for the same conduct. The majority ignores, however, that the impeachment judgment clause cuts against its own position. The clause presumes the availability of criminal process as a backstop by establishing that an official impeached and convicted by the Senate shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. That clause clearly contemplates that a former president may be subject to criminal prosecution for the same conduct that resulted or could have resulted in an impeachment judgment, including such conduct as bribery, which is a criminal act which implicates official acts almost by definition. Because what else would you be bribed to do? Wear a certain color shirt one day? I mean, I suppose it's possible, but you're probably getting bribed to do something that's within your authority to do. She devastates them here. I'm sorry, those of you who are just, either Trump fanatics and won't see it, or are really angry about the fact that Trump is getting railroaded. As I said, two things can be true at one time. I do think he's getting railroaded, and I think the majority opinion is awful. At the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, who was aware that some states' constitutions provided governors immunity, proposed that the convention consider what privileges ought to be allowed to the executive. There is no record of any such discussion. Delegate Charles Pinckney, the person that they hand-waved aside before and said there's no historical evidence because we just dismissed your historical evidence, later explained that the convention which formed the Constitution well knew that no subject has been more abused than privileged, and so it determined to limit privilege to what was necessary and no more. No privilege was intended for the executive. This historical evidence reinforces that from the very beginning, the presumption in this nation has always been that no man is free to flout the criminal law. I'm going to just deal with this a second, where Deflux Streams had disagreed, and I will rebut that. The language of the Constitution doesn't make a distinction to criminal law versus other law. Agree. But in saying things for which the president can be impeached, it mentions bribery, which at the time was a criminal offense, just as it is today. And the only reason someone would have to bribe somebody is for you to do something official. Otherwise, what's the point of bribing? And yes, impeachment is for sitting presidents. This isn't a sitting president. After the Watergate tapes revealed President Nixon's misuse of official power to obstruct the FBI's investigation of the Watergate burglary, President Ford pardoned Nixon. This is really key. Both Ford's pardon and Nixon's acceptance of the pardon necessarily rested on the understanding that the former president faced potential criminal liability. And then they go on to talk about the report of independent counsel in the Iran-Contra matter. It says, because the president, and certainly a past president, is subject to prosecution, the conduct of President Reagan in the Iran-Contra matter was reviewed by independent counsel against the applicable statutes. It was concluded that his conduct fell well short of criminality which could be successfully prosecuted. But in order to even utter that sentence, there had to be the possibility of criminality under acts which undoubtedly were done under color of his office. In sum, the majority today endorses an expansive vision of presidential immunity that was never recognized by the founders, any sitting president, the executive branch, or even President Trump's lawyers until now. And what does she mean by that? Is that President Trump's lawyers, during the impeachment, said, you can't do this now, wait until he's out of office, then prosecute away. Now that he's out of office and they tried to prosecute away, they're birds singing a different song. Now again, I'm not claiming that the cases against him had any merit. I'm just saying that how the tables have turned. Settled understandings of the Constitution are of little use to the majority in this case, and so it ignores them. Setting aside this evidence, the majority announces that former presidents are absolutely, or at least presumptively, immune from criminal prosecution for all of their official acts. The majority purports to keep us in suspense as to whether this immunity is absolute or presumptive, but it quickly gives up the game. It explains that, at a minimum, the president must be immune from prosecution for an official act unless the government can show that applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. And then she goes, no dangers, none at all. So basically, she says what they gave with the left hand, they took away with the right. Maybe some future opinions of this court will decide that presumptive immunity is sufficient and replace the majority's ironclad presumption, which one that makes the difference between presumptive and absolute immunity meaningful. Today's court, however, has placed a presumption of equality before the law with a presumption that the president is above the law for all his official acts. It is one thing to say that motive is irrelevant to questions regarding the scope of civil liability, but it is quite another to make it irrelevant to questions regarding criminal liability. Absolutely agree. I'm sorry, but her dissent is brilliant. Ultimately, the majority pays lip service to the idea that the president charged with enforcing federal criminal laws is not above them. But it then proceeds to place former presidents beyond the reach of the federal criminal laws for any abuse of official power. And it says, and thus reaches a result that the Fitzgerald Court, and that's the one that granted immunity for civil liability, would not have countenanced. So, says, on the facts before it, the court concluded that a merely private suit for damages based on a president's official acts did not serve the interest, meaning the public interest. The court reasoned, and this is in Fitzgerald, that the visibility of the president's office and the effect of his actions on countless people could make him an easy target for civil suits that frequently could distract him from his public duties. The public interest in such private suits, the court concluded, was comparatively weak. There is a lesser public interest in actions for civil damages than, for example, in criminal prosecution. So here's where she's saying there is very good legal argument to not apply Fitzgerald's immunity in civil damages to criminal prosecutions. Therefore, the court held that a former president was immune from such suits. In the context of a federal criminal prosecution of a former president, however, the danger to the functioning of the executive branch is much more reduced. Further, as every member of the Fitzgerald court acknowledged, the public interest in a criminal prosecution is far weightier. Applying the Fitzgerald balancing here should yield the opposite result. Instead, the majority eludes. Was that supposed to be eludes? It says elides. Did I find a mistype in a Supreme Court decision? Or is elides a word and I just don't know it, which is much more likely than me finding a typo. But I'm looking up elides. Is that a word? Omit. Yes. Interesting. There's a word. I never heard. Have you ever heard the word elide? It means to omit. Aha. Let's read this now. I love learning new words. Which is, let me give you a new word for you, which is SCOTUS for me to learn new words. Okay. Instead, the majority elides, omits, any difference between civil and criminal immunity, granting Trump the same immunity from criminal prosecution that Nixon enjoyed from an unlawful termination suit. That is plainly wrong. The majority relies almost entirely on its view of the danger of intrusion on the executive branch to the exclusion of the other side of the balancing test. I'm now on page 16 of the Sotomayor dissent. It says, if the prosecution makes it past a grand jury, the former president still has all the protections our system provides to criminal defendants. If a former president has an argument that a particular statute is unconstitutional as applied to him, this is echoes of Barrett's argument, then he can move to dismiss charges on that ground. Indeed, a former president is likely to have legal arguments that would be available to him that are unavailable to the average criminal defendant. For example, he may be able to rely on a public authority exception from the particular criminal laws. And also, dealing with the interlocutory nature, he can ultimately seek this court's review, and if past practice, including this case, is any indication, he will receive it. And where the majority kept, sounding the alarm bell about mere allegations of malice, it says bare allegations of malice would not make it out of the starting gate, although a private civil action may be brought based on as little as intense feelings. A federal criminal prosecution is made of much firmer stuff. Third, there are long-standing interpretations of
by the executive branch, every sitting president so far has believed himself under the threat of criminal liability after his term in office, and nevertheless has boldly fulfilled the duties of his office. The majority insists that the threat of criminal sanctions is more likely to distort presidential decision-making than the potential payment of civil damages. If that is right, then that distortion has been shaping presidential decision-making since the earliest days of the Republic. Saying because that's been the common understanding. That's her argument. So what exactly is the majority worried about deterring when it expresses great concern for the deterrent effect that the threat of trial, judgment, and imprisonment would pose? It cannot possibly be the deterrence of acts that are truly criminal, nor does it make sense for the majority to wring its hands over the possibility that presidents might stop and think carefully before taking action that borders on criminal. Instead, the majority's main concern could be that presidents will be deterred from taking necessary and lawful action by the fear that their successors might pin them with a baseless criminal prosecution, a prosecution that would most certainly be doomed to fail even if it made it out of the starting gate. Now, I do think she's being overly Pollyanna because I think we have seen we're in the dying embers of an empire. Our justice system is an injustice system. And yes, on paper, what she said is correct. It should never make it out of the starting gate. But we've already seen the ridiculous lawfare against Trump. But that exigent circumstance, as the majority said, should not come into view here. The public interest in the federal criminal prosecution of a former president alleged to have used the powers of his office to commit crimes may be greater still. The president represents all the voters in the nation, and his powers are given by the people under our Constitution. When a president uses the powers of their office for personal gain or as part of a criminal scheme, every person in the country has an interest in the criminal prosecution. The majority overlooks that paramount interest entirely. In the case before us, the public interest and countervailing Article 2 interest are particularly stark. The public interest in this criminal prosecution implicates both. It says the majority believes that a president's anxiety over prosecution overrides the public's interest in accountability and negates the interests of the other branches in carrying out their constitutionally assigned functions. In fact, it is the majority that boils down to ignoring separation of powers. Okay, inherent in Trump's impeachment judgment clause argument is the idea that a former president who was impeached in the House and convicted in the Senate for crimes involving his official acts could then be prosecuted in court for those acts. And then she quotes from the petitioner's brief, the founders thus adopted a carefully balanced approach that permits the criminal prosecution of a former president for his official acts, but only if that president is first impeached by the House and convicted by the Senate. She's going to disagree with that. By extinguishing that path to overcoming immunity, however nonsensical as it might be, because the majority did not agree with Trump, the majority arrives at an official acts immunity even more expansive than the one Trump argued for. On the majority's view, a former president whose abuse of power was so egregious and so offensive, even to members of his own party, that he was impeached in the House and convicted in the Senate, would still be entitled to at least presumptive criminal immunity for those acts. Okay. And I am going on because a lot of this I'd already said. It says, even though the majority's immunity analysis purports to leave unofficial acts open to prosecution, its draconian approach to official acts evidence deprives those prosecutions of any teeth. So she's going, even the little sop they threw the peasants is of no benefit. If the former president cannot be held criminally liable for his official acts, those acts should still be admissible to prove knowledge or intent in criminal prosecutions of unofficial acts. For instance, the majority struggled with classifying whether a president's speech is in his capacity as president, official, or as a candidate, unofficial. Imagine a president states in an official speech that he intends to stop a political rival from passing legislation that he opposes, no matter what it takes to do so. That would be an official act. He then hires a private hitman to murder that political rival. That would be an unofficial act. Under the majority's rule, the murder indictment could include no allegation of the president's public admission of premeditated intent to support the mens rea of murder. That is a strange result, to say the least, but it is a logical result of what they said. Says the majority designates certain conduct immune while refusing to recognize anything as prosecutable in dealing with official acts. The court effectively creates a law-free zone around the president, upsetting the status quo that has existed since the founding. This new official acts immunity now lies about like a loaded weapon for any president that wishes to place his own interests, his own political survival, or his own financial gain above the interests of the nations. When he uses his official powers in any way under the majority's reasoning, he will now be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon, immune. Immune, immune, immune. And I think that's where some people thought she was getting like hysterical. I think it's strongly worded just enough for the broad range, the implications of the majority's ruling. The majority's single-minded fixation on the president's need for boldness and dispatch ignores the countervailing need for accountability and restraint. That sentence should be music to the ears of any libertarian. Okay, now we have Justice Jackson's dissent. And normally, I don't think I've ever liked the things she's written, but I liked what she wrote on this. Oh, she's the one who dealt with affirmative defenses. I thought it was Barrett, and I just didn't highlight it. So she's the one who says, let's not think of, we shouldn't be thinking of this in terms of immunity. We should be thinking of this in terms of affirmative defenses. Damn it, it was her that said that. And this is so creative. Like, this impressed me. She says, importantly, a defense, so an affirmative defense, is not an immunity, even though a defense can likewise result in a person charged with a crime avoiding liability for his criminal conduct. Consistent with our foundational norms, the individual accountability model, she deals with certain models here, and what she's advocating for is individual accountability, which again should be music to the ears of any libertarian. Adheres to the presumption that the law applies to all and that everyone must follow it. Yet the model makes allowances for recognizes defenses. One such defense is the special privilege that government officials sometimes invoke when carrying out their official duties. I wouldn't have worded it that way. So she says, deeds which otherwise would be criminal, such as taking or destroying property, taking hold of a person by force and against his will, placing him in confinement, or even taking his life, are not crimes if done with proper public authority. says the majority's new presidential accountability model, as opposed to her individual accountability model, is distinct insofar as it accepts as a basic starting premise that generally applicable criminal laws do not apply to everyone in our society. The starting presumption is that criminal law does not apply to presidents, no matter how obviously illegal, harmful, or unacceptable a president's official behavior may be. Finally, recall that under the individual accountability model, an indicted former president can raise an affirmative defense just like any other criminal defendant. This means that the president remains answerable to the law insofar as he must show that he was justified in committing a criminal act while in office under the given circumstances. In other words, while the president might indeed be privileged to commit a crime in the course of his official duties, any such privilege exists only when the people, acting through their elected representatives or as members of a jury, determine that the former president's conduct was in fact justified, notwithstanding the general criminal prohibition. Under the majority's immunity regime, by contrast, the president can commit crimes in the course of his job, even under circumstances in which no one thinks he has any excuse. The law simply does not apply to him. Unlike a defendant who invokes an affirmative defense and relies on a legal determination that there was good reason for his otherwise unlawful conduct, a good example of this would be a self-defense, affirmative defense. I mean, generally applicable criminal statutes, it's against the law to shoot somebody dead. But you can raise an affirmative defense of self-defense. So unlike a defendant who invokes affirmative defense and relies on a legal determination that there is good reason for his otherwise unlawful conduct, a former president invoking immunity relies on the premise that he can do whatever he wants, however he wants, so long as he uses his official power in doing so. In the former paradigm, the president remains subject to the law. In the latter, he is above it. She is absolutely right. The apex of the executive branch is made significantly more powerful when the constraints of the criminal law are lifted with respect to the exercise of a president's official duties. After today's ruling, the president must still, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote, yet when acting in his official capacity, he has no obligation to follow those same laws himself. But whatever additional power the majority's new presidential accountability model gives to the presidency, it gives doubly to the court itself, for the majority provides no meaningful guidance how to apply this new paradigm or how to categorize a president's conduct. For instance, its opinion lists some of the core constitutional powers with respect to which the president is now entitled to absolute immunity, a list that apparently includes the removal power, the power to recognize foreign nations, and the pardon power. However, the majority does not and likely cannot supply any useful or administrable definition of the scope of that core. For what it's worth, the Constitution's text does not help either. The Article 2 does not contain a core powers clause, so the actual metes and bounds of the core presidential powers are really anyone's guess. I think she is going a bit overbroad there. I think they did define core. I think she should have been more worried about the perimeter. Perhaps even more troubling, while Congress, the branch of our government most accountable to the people, is the entity our Constitution tasks with deciding as a general matter what conduct is on or off limits, the court has now arrogated that power unto itself when that question pertains to the president. And then she goes on. Here, I will merely observe from a theoretical perspective, philosophers have long considered deterrence to be a key justification for adopting and maintaining systems that ensure accountability for criminal conduct. For that same reason, some commentators also maintain that decreasing the certainty of accountability for wrongful acts, at least arguably, reduces incentives to follow the law. Absolutely. This is not to say that the majority is wrong when it perceives that it can be cumbersome for a president to have to follow the law while carrying out his duty to enforce it. It's certainly true that a scheme of government like ours, no doubt at times, feels the lack of power to act with complete, all-embracing, swiftly moving authority. But any American who has studied history knows that our government was designed to have such restrictions. Our Constitution's separation of powers was adopted by the Convention of 1787 not to promote efficiency, but to preclude the exercise of arbitrary power. The purpose was not to avoid friction, but to save the people from autocracy. Oh my God, that is so good. To the extent that the majority's new accountability paradigm allows presidents to evade punishment for their criminal acts while in office, the seeds of absolute power for presidents has been planted. That, there was some really good quotes in there from the dissents. I am going to probably post some of those on Twitter. I guessed this would be 2 hours, and it's 2 hours and 5 minutes, so I guessed pretty right, just judging by the length of that case. And I'm losing my voice, as hopefully you can tell, because I get into this stuff. That's why I've been a paralegal for 35 years. Yes, I have been a paralegal for 35 years. So, yeah, I like covering legal stuff, and maybe we'll do some more of this. We'll certainly be following along with this Trump stuff. So I hope you found this interesting. I know this isn't everyone's cup of tea to go so painstakingly through it, but I gave you my views while really just reading from the case. Now, I may have omitted some points you thought were more important, but I did highlight an awful lot, and I hope that you guys found it useful. Deflux Streams asked, does anywhere in the text, does it talk about if the DOJ has authority to investigate? And I believe it did, in passing, and said that it did. I believe so, but that isn't part of what I really concentrated on, to be honest with you. Earlier in the live chat, but you could also Google it, there's a searchable PDF on the Supreme Court website that you could do some word searches for some of these things. So before I lose my voice, absolutely, like the immunity that the president now has, I am going to go. Those of you watching this after the fact, if you appreciate, going on into a deep dive into this for 2 hours, I'd really appreciate if you would consider becoming one of my patrons at patreon.com/Pink Flame of Liberty, or shoot me a super chat or a super thanks. It is greatly appreciated. Unlike a lot of commentators, I'm not going to say all of them. I mean, I obviously did go through this. I probably spent 4 hours reading and digesting and trying to understand it, because I just did not want to give you vacuous sound bites. There's just already too much of that in today's political reality. All right. I hope you have a good night. Mi guapas de libertad.
You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in the business, not because they wanna